How Africa became involved in World War One. Hello Displorers! Welcome to another informative video presented to you by Displorer, and thanks for watching. In this video we shall examine how Africa became involved in World War One. World War One was one of the deadliest wars ever in the world history, and it was considered the war to end all wars. During World War One, most African colonies were under their colonial masters, which implied that they had to assist their masters to fight the war, either willingly or by force, or using threats and fake promises of liberation or ownership. Africans participated and died in the First World War as soldiers or carriers, contributing food and other resources needed by their colonies, but their sacrifice had been largely forgotten, and the most impressive monument for African victims of the World War I is not even found in Africa, but in France. If you are new here, welcome. Be sure to subscribe and turn notifications so you don't miss any of our videos. In this video, we shall recount the experience of African soldiers, African carriers, and African civilians, paying attention to how Africans participated and how they were in turn affected. But let's look at why Africans even got entangled in this messy show of power by these foreign bodies. The First World War was essentially a quarrel between European powers, which eventually involved Africa, both directly and indirectly, because at the outbreak of the hostilities, the greater part of it was ruled by the European belligerents. Campaigns were fought on African soil, which, though they only marginally affected the overall course of the war, had significant implications for Africa. By the time the war ended, every country in Africa, with the exception of the small Spanish territories, which remained neutral, had been formally committed to one side or the other. Belgian, British, French, Italian, and Portuguese administrations were allied more or less actively against German colonies. Even the last remaining independent states on the continent, Liberia, Ethiopia, and Därfür, became involved. Liberia declared for the Allies on the entry of the United States into the war in 1917. Immediately the war in Europe was declared, the invasion of Africa by the Allies of Germany's colonies was fast. Neither side had prepared for war in sub-Saharan Africa. Indeed, there was short-lived hope that it might be isolated from the war. Governor Doring of Togo suggested to his neighbors in British Gold Coast, now Ghana, and French Dahomey, now Benin, that Togo should be neutralized, so that the spectacle of Europeans fighting each other would not be witnessed by their African subjects. In German East Africa, now Tanzania, the governor, Schnee, was intent on avoiding hostilities, so he could pursue his energetic program of development. And when the British bombarded Dar es Salaam shortly after the declaration of war, he subscribed to a short-lived truce that would neutralize German East Africa. There was an optimism in some quarters that the articles of the Berlin Act of 1885, covering the neutrality of the conventional basin of the Congo, would avert war in East Central Africa. The forces in favor of involving Germany's African possessions in the war were however more pressing. From the point of view of Britain, given her naval supremacy, the strategy as laid down by the Committee for Imperial Defense was to carry war to her enemies' colonies. To maintain this naval supremacy, Germany's African communication system and principal ports had to be put out of action. For the Allies, successful campaigns in Germany's colonial possessions might result in their being shared by the victors as spoils of war. This was certainly a major consideration in the decision of the Commandant-General of the South African Forces, General Louis Botha, and the Minister of Defense, J.C. Smuts, in the face of real opposition from Afrikaner irreconcilables, to commit South African forces to the Allied side and invade German Southwest Africa, and later participate in the East African Campaign. Not only did Botha and Smuts cover Southwest Africa as a potential fifth province, but they hoped that if they assisted a British victory in German East Africa, part of the conquered German territory might be offered to the Portuguese in exchange for De La Goa. In Britain, it was considered that the involvement of South Africa and her loyalty would be ensured by the prospect of Southwest Africa, now Namibia, becoming hers. For the French, invasion of Cameroon would retrieve the territory reluctantly ceded in 1911 to Germany in the aftermath of the Agadir crisis. Even Belgium, which had immediately invoked the perpetual neutrality of the Congo under Article X of the Berlin Act, eagerly joined in the invasion of German African territory, once her own neutrality had been violated by the Germans. That was in hope that successful participation would give her a bargaining position in the eventual peace settlement. Germany's colonies were not easily defensible, given Allied naval supremacy and her much smaller colonial forces. There was early optimism that the anticipated speedy German victory in Europe would avoid direct colonial involvement, while achieving Germany's ambition of a Mid-Africa linking Cameroon and German East Africa, and thwarting once and for all Britain's longed for Cape to Cairo route. But once it was clear that quick victory would not be achieved, it was perceived that protracted campaigns in Africa would tie down Allied colonial troops who might otherwise be sent to the European front. This strategy was brilliantly pursued by the General P.E. von Lettow-Vorbeck, the German commander in East Africa, who engaged a combined Allied force at one time over 10 times greater than his own for the duration of the war. Given that the war broke out in Europe in 1914, English and French troops had prepared to seize the 4 German colonies in Africa, which were German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, Togoland, and Cameroon. Fighting was particularly brutal in German East Africa, where German General Lettow-Vorbeck adopted a guerrilla strategy, drawing more and more areas into the war. More than 200,000 bearers transported weapons, ammunition, and food for the troops. In reality, these men had been torn from their roots and were looked down on by local populations. Back home, they were missed in the fields, harvests suffered or were plundered and destroyed by troops passing through to ensure there would be no food left for their pursuers. Recruitment methods. Over 1 million troops were actually recruited during the war to supplement the generally small forces maintained by the colonial authorities. Only France had substantial armies on the ground in her various African colonies on the outbreak of the war, and though subsequently Germany was accused of militarizing her colonies, it was really France alone against whom this accusation could be leveled with accuracy. All in all, over 2.5 million Africans, or well over 1% of the population of the continent, were involved in war work of some kind. Recruits for both fighting and carrier service were raised by 3 methods. The first was on purely volunteer basis, where Africans offered their services freely, without any outside pressure, such as the Egyptians, the Senegalese citoyens, and Madagascar troops, who did so for some benefits. Large numbers of soldiers and carriers, however, were formally recruited in an attempt to create a black army. Chiefs were given quotas of men of ill and rounded up strangers and former slaves to avoid enlisting their immediate dependents or kingsmen. Compulsory recruitment was also used to raise troops and carriers in British East Africa under the Compulsory Service Order of 1915, which made all males aged between 18 and 45 liable for military service. This was the method mostly used in northern Rhodesia, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and Congo. Consequences of the war. The war came and left the continent with more dead than they could be counted, distrust amongst Africans, separation, and more havoc than ever acknowledged. There are no accurate figures saying how many people died of hunger. The fact that the colonial administrative area of Dodoma, in what is now Tanzania, lost 20% of its population in 1917 and 1918 gives some indication of the deprivation and misery. Historians estimate that 1 million people died in East Africa as a direct result of the war. It's no different in Cameroon, also a former German colony, where several thousand black soldiers and bearers died. With the defeat of Germany, it did not mean freedom, but simply that African colonies acquired new masters, Britain and France. When the victorious power signed the Treaty of Versailles to seal the end of the war, they laid down people's right to self-determination, but this did not apply to Africa. It was the gradual spread of independence through Africa that began in the early 1950s that represented real change, and which is now marked with anniversary celebrations and national holidays. While the war directly took an enormous toll in dead and wounded in Africa, it further accounted for innumerable indirect deaths in the Africa-wide influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919, whose spread was facilitated by the movement of troops and carriers returning home. Because of the role played by chiefs in recruiting indigents into the war, it led to the people hating their chiefs. Much of the unpopularity of chiefs in northern Rhodesia after the war can be attributed to their role in recruitment of soldiers and carriers. Conclusion: Europe generally ignores the suffering of millions of Africans in the World War I, treating it as just a minor skirmish in which hardly anyone was hurt. But this war was a turning point into the lives of so many Africans. Death, hunger, lost trust, displacement were just a few of the issues brought about by this cruel war. And if that was the end of the continent's suffering caused by their colonial masters, maybe recovery would have been much faster. But that was not the case, as another war was imminent in the horizon, which tore the continent more apart than before. There you have it, explorers. That was how Africa became involved in World War I. Thanks for watching this video, and if you did enjoy the video, to give it a thumbs up. Do not forget to subscribe and share with your friends.